We will finish up our study on the Romantic era by studying about Wagner and Stephen Foster. You will find information about Wagner on pages 340 through 346, and then a little bit about Stephen Foster, where you have to jump ahead in your textbook on pages 415 to 416. I just wanted to show what was happening in American music at the same time all of this great music is happening over in the European countries. America is beginning to grow in its own form of music as well, and that's why I throw Stephen Foster in here. And I hope you enjoy another musical comedian, and that is Bugs Bunny. And so, of course, Bugs Bunny and the Looney Tunes took a lot of classical music and made it into funny musical cartoons to watch. And so as we watch about Wagner's opera, I hope you enjoy the Bugs Bunny rendition of What's Opera, Doc. Today we will start with our Wagner student report. So go ahead and click on the link on our page from our student who is doing the Wagner report. The first Wagner tidbit I want to share with you is that he worked in the Neuschwanstein Castle, and there was a theater built just for his operas. And this is where Wagner wrote and produced operas for King Ludwig II. And this castle is actually the model for the Disney castle that you see as the opening of all of the Disney movies and in the theme parks of Disney. And so this Neuschwanstein Castle was the model for this, and this is where Wagner worked for much of his career. More Wagner tidbits is that Wagner was usually in debt. He borrowed a lot of money to produce his huge operas and to support his luxurious lifestyle. In fact, he often had to move from town to town just because his creditors were running him out of town, and he didn't have the money to pay them back. Although he was highly successful, he was a little bit like Mozart in that he overspent the success that he had. Even though he was making lots of money, he spent more money than he made. Wagner also would have fit nicely into the tabloids of today. So this is a quote taken from our textbook, page 341. Wagner fell in love with Cosima von Bülow. She was Liszt's daughter and the wife of Hans von Bülow, who was Wagner's close friend and favorite conductor. Cosima gave birth to two of Wagner's children while still married to von Bülow. Shortly after Wagner's first wife died, he married Cosima. And so you see this Hollywood lifestyle is beginning during the Romantic era, where they just often lose their moral compass in their fame and fortune. A condensed description in our textbook, again on the same page 341 from our textbook, says that Wagner was a towering musical genius, and he was allied with utter selfishness, ruthlessness, and absolute conviction about his place in history. So he was determined to become rich and famous, and he didn't care who he had to step on or destroy in order to get there. Wagner was also the first person to really use a lot of leitmotifs. Leitmotifs are recurrent musical ideas associated with a person, object, or thought in the drama. Leitmotifs are used a lot today in movies. So if you click on the YouTube link, you can see an example of songs today that are in movies that when you hear them, you think of a certain character or a certain philosophy, or it brings to mind a specific movie because of the theme that is connected to that. And so these are leitmotifs that are musical representations of characters, objects, or thoughts in the drama that were first used extensively by Wagner. Many people today were first introduced to classical music as children and as they were watching cartoons. Bugs Bunny cartoons often incorporate classical music into their cartoons. And one in specific is called Watts Opera Doc. And it uses music from Wagner's The Ring Cycle as the background of it. And of course, they put in humorous words sung by Elmer Fudd and Bugs Bunny to one another. But I hope you'll enjoy watching this and see how modern pop culture of cartoons have incorporated classical music from long ago and made it sort of modernized so that younger generations listen to this classical music unawares, because they're thinking they're just watching a cartoon. Before leaving the Romantic era, I want to jump ahead to pages 415 to 416 to show the stark contrast in Romantic era music of Europe versus Romantic era music of the United States. And we're going to study a little bit about Stephen Foster, who was born in 1826 and he died in 1864. This is the same time frame as all these famous composers who are writing this majestic music in Europe. But yet, Stephen Foster is writing music in America, does not have a lot of contact with all these great composers of Europe, and he is writing what is to become American music. And so he is the father of American music, which is quite different from what we've been listening to. Stephen Foster is known as the father of American music. He's one of the very first composers that was actually born in the United States and was a composer. Many of the other composers who composed while they were in the United States had not been born in America. They'd been born in another country. They came over, composed music for a while, conducted for a while, and then headed back to their own home country. But Stephen Foster was born and died in the United States, and he was one of our very first composers. Therefore, he's called the father of American music. He was born in Lawrenceville, Pennsylvania in 1826, and he studied in private academies, studying Latin and Greek, math and grammar and diction and the classics. So he went to a lot of private schools, had come from a fairly well-to-do family. His family apparently didn't totally value music, so they didn't provide him with music lessons. So he taught himself how to play the guitar, clarinet, violin, flute, and piano. And he would sit around with his buddies when he was a teenager, and they would just play music together, and he really enjoyed music. He befriended a music dealer who owned a big music store, and he gave him a few music lessons. And he also was mentored by a black-faced clown entertainer. So we'll study a little bit more about that in a moment. But on the stage during that time frame, again, this is during the Civil War type of time frame in the United States. There was not racial integration on the stage. And so if you needed to have a black person portrayed on the stage, then you would just paint the face of a white person black so that you could have an entertainer who would represent the African American. And so they were called black-faced clown entertainers. And again, we'll study just a little bit more about that and how the minstrel music of the day was used and was very popular. Upon high school graduation, Foster worked as a bookkeeper for his brother's steamship company. And during this time, he composed "Oh, Susanna," which became the theme song for the California Gold Rush. And so we will listen to this piece at the end of our study of Foster, but it's just that, "Oh, I come from Alabama with a banjo on my knee." So very famous, "Oh, Susanna, oh, don't you cry for me." So lots of pieces that you will recognize because they're just folk songs that we grew up with as children, and they were composed by Stephen Foster. Foster's compositions were made very popular by the Christie Minstrels. They were a traveling minstrel show entertainment troupe. So to kind of describe what this group was like, you have to think of the guy selling tonic that will make your hair grow with the Carnival Musical sideshow. So these shows would travel from town to town. They would just pack up their wagons, and they would, go to the city center, the town center, and just say, "Come tonight or for the next 3 days, we're going to be having a show. There'll be music, there'll be acrobats, there'll be singing, there'll be dancing, and there'll be people selling, tonics to make your hair grow and to make your warts go away. And so that's kind of what this was. And they would just travel from town to town, entertaining people, and they would pack up and move to the next place. But the Christy Minstrel Show was quite popular. And Foster started publishing his music, and he signed a contract with the Christy Minstrels and quit his bookkeeping job to compose. And his music was quite popular. And again, it was really made more popular by the Christy Minstrels. As they would go from town to town, his pieces were the most popular and the most requested. Foster composed over 200 popular minstrel show and parlor songs. So I've described the minstrel show. The parlor songs are like the fancy room in your house, the living room in your house, where you invite your guests in, and you had the expensive furniture, and you brought in tea and cookies, and you would sit around the piano and entertain your friends with popular music. And much of this would have been written by Stephen Foster. Unfortunately, copyright laws were new, and when they were not being regularly enforced. So publishers stole his music and published it without giving Foster any of the profits. So in other words, they would say, oh, Camptown Races is so popular. Jeannie with the light brown hair is very popular. Oh, Susanna is very popular. We want to include those in our books. And so they would take the music, print it, and sell the music, and keep all the profits for themselves, and never give any of it to Stephen Foster. And copyright laws were not being strongly enforced. This, combined with the financial woes of the Civil War, left Foster poverty-stricken. And so not only did he lose his money, his wife and his daughter left him as well. They just said, we're tired of being poor. You have no money. We're going back to live with mom and dad, or I'm going back to live with my mother, or whatever. And so his wife and daughter left him, and he was all by himself. He died at the age of 37 from a fall. He had gone to New York City, was trying to get some financial stability there, and he got a bad fever. And you know how often when you have a fever, you're kind of dizzy. He got up to maybe go get a drink or something, and he fell and hit his head, and he bled almost to death in his hotel room. Of course, the ambulance came and took him to the hospital, but he died in New York City in the hospital 3 days later. And all the money he had left at that time was in his pockets, and he had some Civil War credits and a few pennies. And so Civil War credits were used especially in the South because currency and money was being printed up in the North, and this money was not getting down into the South. And so people in the South are using Civil War credits to say, I will, pay you later, or this has value here in the South, but it really didn't have a whole lot of value up north where he was at the time of his death. Minstrel show music was one of the very first examples of pop music in the United States. This was, again, music troupes that would go from town to town, providing just popular music for the masses. This was not intended for religious services. It was not intended to uplift the soul and the spirit. It was not a long, drawn-out drama of the opera. It was just little short, popular songs that were nonsense lyrics that were just meant to be funny and provide entertainment for people after a long day's work. On the left would be an example here of a poster or a flyer that might go out as the minstrel show would come into town, and they would say, come and see William West's Big Minstrel Jubilee, where you'll see Billy Van, the great entertainer, and he'll be singing and dancing and playing musical instruments. And then you see on the right a picture of a black-faced singer, a banjo player, and these were very popular forms of entertainment back during the Civil War era. Now let's listen to two pieces written by Stephen Foster for these minstrel shows. They became quite popular, and again, this is the beginning of American popular music. We have O Susanna which is just a nonsense song with words such as, "It rained so hard the day I left, the weather it was dry, the sun so hot I froze to death, Susanna, don't you cry." So just silly words to go along with that. And then you have Camptown Ladies, which is the talking about the Camptown racetrack, which was near Foster's boyhood home. And so you'll actually see in this video early movie footage of a horse running. And that was one of the earliest movies made of a horse running. And so these were also probably sung in parlors because they were so popular that when people would gather and their friends would come over, they would sit around the piano and sing these popular songs. So the Romantic era is just a great time for music. I think it's probably my most favorite era of music because the music is telling such great stories. And I think it's just very interesting, and the harmonies are just so lush and beautiful. As we go into the 20th century, they become more harsh. And so I don't enjoy those quite as well. The Romantic era is just beautiful harmonies. And so we will start next time studying about 20th century music.